The crowd gathered in silence. A soft wind blew across the marble stones, carrying with it the weight of history, sacrifice, and honor. At the center of it all stood the tomb guard, motionless, rifle at his shoulder, eyes forward, the very embodiment of discipline. His face betrayed nothing, not the heat of the sun nor the whispers of tourists. To him, the world outside did not exist. His mission was eternal, to guard the fallen, without question, without pause. But on this day, the silence was about to shatter. From the corner of the crowd, a ripple of unease began to spread. Two uniformed police officers pushed their way forward, their radios crackling faintly, their steps sharp and deliberate. People turned, eyebrows furrowing, unsure of what could possibly justify such an intrusion at a place where even a cough felt disrespectful. The guard did not move. He didn't even blink. One of the officers barked, "Step aside, soldier. We need you to clear this post immediately." A murmur ran through the gathering. Cameras lifted, phones tilted. Nobody had ever seen this before. Cops ordering a tomb guard to move. Still, the soldier remained like stone. The officers exchanged a glance. A sense of irritation flickered in their eyes, as if they weren't accustomed to being ignored. The taller one stepped closer, boots clicking on the pavement. His shadow cut across the soldier's uniform. "I said move. This is an order." And yet, nothing. The crowd held its breath. Children clutched their parents' hands. Veterans who had worn the same uniform decades earlier felt their blood begin to boil. Everyone understood what they were witnessing wasn't just a man standing still. It was honor on the line. Seconds stretched like hours. The officer's jaw tightened. His hand twitched toward the soldier's arm, as if ready to force him aside. The other officer spoke into his radio, calling for backup. A woman whispered, almost trembling, "Why are they doing this?" No one had an answer. But in the back of the crowd, a reporter raised her camera. The red recording light blinked alive. She knew this moment, whatever happened next, would not just be seen here. It would be seen everywhere. And then came the sentence that froze the air itself. "You have 5 minutes, or we'll move you ourselves." The guard stood tall, rifle glinting in the sunlight. He did not shift, did not speak. His silence roared, louder than any command. 5 minutes, the crowd could feel it. The world was about to witness something unforgettable. Asterisk for most people in that crowd. The tomb guard was just a soldier in a crisp uniform, faceless, voiceless, an unshakable figure carved out of discipline. But behind the silent stance stood a man with a story. His name was Sergeant Daniel Cross, though few ever spoke it here. To the world he was only the guard, but Daniel's journey to this post had been long, brutal, and marked by scars that no one could see. Years earlier, Daniel had been deployed to a distant battlefield. He was young then, full of fire, still believing wars were clean, heroic things. But reality tore that illusion apart in a single night. His unit had been ambushed in a valley, bullets raining down from the cliffs, explosions ripping through the dust. Amid the chaos, his closest friend, Corporal Mason Reed, was hit. Daniel dragged him nearly half a mile under fire, blood soaking his uniform, refusing to let go. But Mason never opened his eyes again. That moment carved itself into Daniel's soul. The last words Mason had spoken, hours earlier round a dim campfire, still echoed. "If I don't make it home, promise me you'll remember me. Don't let me be forgotten." Daniel never forgot. When he came home, medals were pinned on his chest, hands were shaken, and speeches were made. But none of it healed the silence in his heart. Mason's absence followed him like a shadow. And so, when the opportunity came to apply for the old guard, the elite soldiers who stood watch at the tomb of the unknown soldier, Daniel knew where he needed to be. It wasn't just duty, it was personal. Every second he spent on the marble plaza was a vow, a whispered answer to his fallen brother. "You will never be forgotten, not while I stand." The tomb itself was more than stone. Beneath its weight lay the remains of those who could not be named. Men who gave everything yet returned to no family, no grave, no marker. They belonged to everyone and no one, and the guard's presence was the eternal answer to that sacrifice. Rain, snow, blistering heat, none of it mattered. The watch never ended. Silence was the language. Stillness was the weapon. Tourists who visited often left in awe, struck by the unyielding discipline of the guard. Children were hushed by parents. Veterans stood straighter, and even the busiest of politicians usually bowed their heads. Usually, but not all men respected silence. Among the crowd that day was Councilman Richard Hale, a man whose reputation in the city was as loud as his voice. He was no ordinary spectator. Arrogant, power-drunk, always dressed in tailored suits that screamed more about wealth than honor. Haler believed rules were meant for others, never for him. He wasn't there to pay respect. He was there to prove a point. For weeks, Haler had been locked in a public feud with military officials over funding and ceremonies he called a waste of taxpayer money. He argued that standing guards in the 21st century was an outdated show, a relic of the past. To him, it was theater, unnecessary, symbolic nonsense. And now, here he was, stepping into the heart of the very tradition he mocked, ready to make his statement. He wanted cameras. He wanted headlines. He wanted the image of a powerful man walking where no one else dared. And when he saw Sergeant Daniel standing his eternal post, unmoved by anything, Hale smiled. This was his stage. At first, his presence was subtle, a man in an expensive coat, lingering at the edge of the barrier, but those close to him noticed how his voice carried just a little louder than necessary, how his dismissive laughter cut through the respectful hush like a knife. Imagine, Hale said with a chuckle, just loud enough for nearby visitors to hear, paying people to stand around like statues. What century is this? Some tourists frowned. A veteran in the back clenched his jaw, but Hale thrived on reactions. He leaned against a chain meant to keep civilians at a distance, shaking his head in mock pity. This is what they call honor, a man wasting his life standing still. Still, Daniel did not move. His eyes were locked forward, his breathing measured, his mind as still as the marble beneath his boots. He had trained for this, trained to let insults, distractions, even shouts from unruly tourists roll off him like rain. Discipline was not reacting. But as Hale's comments grew louder, something else stirred. The attention of the police. The officers weren't there for tradition. They weren't guardians of silence. They were enforcers of order, and when a powerful councilman gestured toward them with impatience, they moved. The symbolic weight of the moment began to sharpen. Tomb of the unknown soldier was more than a grave. It was a promise etched into stone, a covenant between the living and the dead, and in front of it now stood two paths, one of honor, silent and unbreakable, and another of arrogance, loud and unrestrained. Daniel Cross knew which side he stood on, but Councilman Hale, backed by officers who believed authority came from badges and not from sacrifice, was determined to show otherwise. The crowd felt it. A storm was gathering in the silence. The quiet dignity of the plaza began to fracture under the weight of one man's arrogance. Councilman Hale stepped closer to the chain that separated visitors from sacred ground, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, cutting through the respectful silence like a drumbeat of disrespect. He smirked at the guard, stone-faced, just like they told me. I wonder if you even hear me, soldier, or if you're too busy pretending to be important. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A mother instinctively pulled her child closer. A veteran in a faded army cap muttered, "Show some damn respect." But Hale only fed off the tension. He wanted this. He turned toward the onlookers, spreading his arms as if addressing an audience at a campaign rally. "Ladies and gentlemen, your tax dollars at work." Men standing around, holding guns, marching in circles, all for a stone box. He tapped the chain with his finger, his voice rising in mock authority. "You think this makes us strong? You think this keeps our country safe?" His words struck like hammers on fragile glass, breaking the sacred stillness. Sergeant Daniel Cross did not move. His eyes were fixed forward, shoulders squared, rifle balanced against his shoulder with mechanical precision. But inside, he felt the fire flicker, not anger, not yet, but the sharp awareness that disrespect was bleeding across the line he had sworn to defend. The officers approached more boldly now, encouraged by Hale's beckoning hand. "Sir," one of them said firmly, "we'll handle this." "Step back," Haley chuckled. "Handle it? You mean handle him?" He pointed at the guard. "Tell this soldier his little statue game is over. He's in my way." The taller officer straightened. "Soldier," he barked, his voice carrying across the plaza, "you are ordered to step away from your post immediately." Murmurs exploded in the crowd. Tourists pulled out their phones. Red lights blinked as cameras rolled. The guard didn't blink, didn't flinch. Hale clapped his hands once, mock applause. "Oh, it's even better in person. Look at him, frozen like a mannequin. Does he even know we're talking to him?" Children shifted nervously, sensing the ugliness in the air. One little boy whispered to his father, "Why won't he stop?" The father shook his head, jaw tight. "Because some people never learned what respect means." Minutes stretched, every second heavier than the last. The officers repeated that order, louder this time. Their boots echoed against the stone as they closed the distance. "Step aside, soldier," That's a direct order. Nothing. Daniel's training surged through him. He had memorized it, lived it. A guard does not break bearing. A guard does not yield to distraction. A guard does not speak unless ceremony demands it. Silence was not weakness, silence was command. But Hale twisted the silence into something else. He laughed again, a sharp, cutting sound. See that? He thinks he's above the law, standing there like some kind of saint. His eyes gleamed as he leaned closer to the chain. But I know the truth. He's just a kid hiding behind a uniform, playing soldier because he couldn't handle the real world. That one cut deep. Veterans in the crowd bristled. A man with a cane slammed its tip against the ground and shouted, "That man's done more for this country in silence than you've ever done in your entire life." The crowd murmured in agreement, voices rising in anger. Phones lifted higher. Every second of this confrontation was being recorded from a dozen angles, but Hale wasn't deterred. He thrived on the chaos. He stepped right up to the chain, leaning over it, his face inches from Daniel's. "What's the matter, soldier? Cat got your tongue, or maybe you're just scared. Scared because you know this is all a joke, a waste." His hand reached out, brushing the chain as if daring himself to cross. A sharp command snapped from the veterans gathered. "Don't you cross that line." But Hale only smirked. "What are you going to do?" "He won't stop me. He can't even speak." He turned his back deliberately on the guard, addressing the officers again. "You see, this is what I mean, pageantry theater. I could walk right up there, and he wouldn't do a thing." He was testing, pushing, step by step, breaking the invisible wall that had always protected the tomb from arrogance. The officers were torn. Their authority told them to maintain order, but even they hesitated now, sensing the weight of the sacred ground beneath their boots. Still, Hale's influence was strong. "Do it," he ordered them coldly. "Move him, or I will." The taller officer's voice shook, betraying unease. "Sir, I don't think do it." Hale roared. The air grew heavy. No birds chirped. No wind stirred. The world seemed to hold its breath. Daniel Cross did not blink, did not shift, did not even acknowledge the storms swirling around him. Crowd reactions turned into a boiling pot of emotions. Children clung tighter to their parents. Veterans muttered prayers or clenched fists, ready to step in if no one else would. Tourists whispered nervously, uncertain if they should leave or stay. Reporters adjusted tripods, sensing the moment would explode into history. Every camera caught Hale's smirk, the officer's hesitation, and the soldier's stillness. Then came the breaking point. Hale laughed one final time and reached into his pocket, pulling out a shiny pen with his campaign logo stamped on its side. He twirled it between his fingers, then pointed it like a weapon toward the guard's face. "Watch this, folks. Let's see if the statue reacts." The crowd gasped as Hale extended his hand toward the guard's pristine uniform. His finger hovered just above the medal pinned to Daniel's chest. One whisper rose from the crowd, trembling and furious. "Don't you dare." But Hale leaned closer, his voice dripping with disdain. "This doesn't mean anything. Not to me, not to anyone who matters." And then the pen tapped against Daniel's chest. It was small, a simple tap. But to everyone watching, it was as if Hale had struck the very heart of the tomb itself. The crowd erupted in gasps and shouts. A woman screamed, "Stop!" A veteran surged forward before others held him back. Children buried their faces in their parents' coats. And yet, through it all, Daniel did not move. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his body remained a fortress of discipline. The taller officer froze. "Sir," but Hale was emboldened now, his voice dripping with triumph. "See, nothing. He's powerless, just a boy in costume." He shoved the pen back into his pocket and gave the soldier's shoulder a light shove. That was it. The moment hung suspended in the air like a thundercloud about to break. The crowd went silent. So silent you could hear the faint rattle of a flag on its pole, the distant hum of a car engine blocks away. Everyone knew something was coming. Daniel's eyes locked forward, unblinking, unyielding. But deep inside, his vow burned hotter than ever. He had promised Mason Reed. He had promised every name carved into stone. No one would dishonor this ground. Not while he stood. And though his body remained still, the silence around him began to feel less like weakness and more like the calm before an inevitable storm. The air was brittle, like glass stretched too thin, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. Councilman Hale's smug shove lingered in the crowd's memory like a slap across every face present, a shove against a tomb guard, against a uniform, against the fallen. For a second, there was no sound at all, not even breath. Then a child began to cry. His small voice cracked the silence, trembling with fear. His mother bent to hush him, but the sound had already rippled through the crowd, sharpening the weight of what had just happened. Hale stood tall, smirk carved across his face. He spread his arms wide, spinning half a circle as if to present the guard to his audience. See nothing. A statue, a mannequin, a waste of money and boots. He turned back, leaning close enough to whisper mockingly into Daniel Cross's ear. You're not a hero, you're just a boy, too scared to speak. And then it happened. Daniel moved. That wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rushed. It was precise, a single, deliberate step forward. The click of his heel against the stone plaza cracked the silence like thunder. Gasps shot through the crowd. Dozens of phones jolted upward, capturing every frame. Hale's smirk faltered, just slightly, but he forced a laugh to cover it. Oh, he finally breaks character. But the laugh died in his throat when Daniel's rifle, gleaming in the sunlight, shifted ever so slightly, the steel bayonet angled with surgical precision. Between Hale and the tomb, the movement was crisp, flawless, honed through endless hours of training. The crowd felt it like electricity. The officers stiffened, caught between instinct and awe. One of them muttered under his breath, "Oh God." And then Daniel's voice rang out, low, controlled, a voice carved from granite and steel. Stand back. 3 words. Nothing more, but they thundered across the plaza with the weight of centuries. The crowd froze, mouths parted. A veteran whispered. He spoke, as though witnessing something sacred. Hale blinked, his bravado shaken. For the first time, the mask of arrogance cracked. His lips parted, but no words came. He glanced at the bayonet's gleam, at the soldiers' burning eyes, at the immovable wall of discipline standing inches from him. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Then Daniel spoke again, his voice steady, unflinching. "Do not dishonor the fallen." The words echoed, bouncing, against stone and heart alike. They weren't just a warning, they were a sentence, a verdict carried on behalf of every name, every sacrifice, every soldier who never came home. The crowd exhaled as one, like they had been holding their breath forever. A woman clutched her chest, whispering, "God bless him." Cameras zoomed, fingers shook as people tried to steady their phones. Reporters scribbled furiously. History was being written in silence and steel. Hale stepped back half a pace, his eyes darting nervously. But arrogance is a stubborn disease, and he forced a sneer back onto his face. "You think you can threaten me? I'm a councilman." The bayonet tilted an inch closer, so precise it looked choreographed. Daniel didn't need to raise his voice. His eyes said everything. Hale stumbled backward, tripping over his polished shoe. The crowd gasped as he caught himself on the chain barrier, his composure faltering in full view of 100 lenses. The once commanding politician looked suddenly small, just another man, exposed before the weight of honor. Silence fell again. The crowd stood frozen, the kind of silence that feels alive, vibrating in the bones. Children peered wide-eyed from behind their parents' legs. Veterans saluted instinctively, tears brimming in eyes that had seen too much. The officers didn't move. They knew better now. Authority wasn't in the badge. Not here. Not today. Authority stood in perfect uniform, rifle gleaming, eyes burning, with duty. Every second stretched, carved into memory. Then came the sound. Boots, heavy, synchronized. From the far end of the plaza, a squad of military police emerged, their formation sharp, their pace unyielding. The rhythm of their march echoed like drums of judgment. The crowd parted instinctively, whispers surging like waves. Phones whipped toward the approaching soldiers. Hale's face drained of color. He stammered, "Wait, what is this? Who called them?" The military police didn't answer. They marched straight through the crowd, their boots striking the pavement in unison. Their commanding officer stepped forward, his eyes flicking briefly to Daniel, and in that single look, respect passed between warriors. The officer turned toward Hale, voice like steel. "Councilman Hale, you are out of line." The words cut through the air like a blade. Hale sputtered, waving his hands. You can't talk to me like that. I'm a public official. This is harassment." But no one believed him. Not anymore. Not after what they had seen. The crowd began to murmur, louder now, voices rising with courage. "Shame." Someone shouted. Others joined. "Show some respect." "Not here. Not ever." The chants grew, a tide of fury against one man's arrogance. Hale's face twisted, caught between rage and panic. He turned to the police officers who had once backed him, but even they shifted uneasily, no longer willing to stand against the tide of honor. Daniel hadn't moved since his words. His rifle was steady, his breathing measured, his stance unbreakable. He had done his part, he had defended the line. Now the weight shifted. The military police flanked him, their presence a wall of protection. The commanding officer saluted Daniel crisp, sharp, undeniable, before turning back to Hale. "This ground is sacred. You will not disgrace it again." The crowd erupted in applause. Hands clapped. Cheers burst forth. Veterans shouted through tears. Children beamed with pride. The plaza that had been so tense, so suffocating with silence, now thundered with gratitude. And yet, through it all, Daniel didn't move. He didn't smile, didn't break. His duty remained. He slowly stepped back into perfect position, rifle aligned, eyes forward, the bayonet once again guarding the unknown. As if nothing had happened. The applause swelled, phones captured every second. The story was already rushing toward the digital veins of the world, destined to go viral. But for those standing there, no screen could ever capture the electricity of that moment, the weight of 3 words. Power of silence, the sight of a soldier who refused to bend, and in that moment, the world learned, stillness is strength. The plaza had transformed. What had begun as an uneasy gathering of tourists was now a living tribunal. The crowd's voices, once whispers, surged in waves of outrage and pride. Cameras flashed, chants rose, and every eye was fixed on the man who had tried to defile the sacred. Councilman Richard Hale stood trembling, his polished shoes scuffed, his confidence unraveling under the gaze of hundreds. His smirk had dissolved into a desperate mask. The red vein in his forehead pulsed as he shouted over the chants. "You can't do this. I'm an elected official. I'll have you all fired, every one of you." But his words were drowned out by the crowd's roar. "Respect the fallen, respect the fallen." The chant rolled like thunder, echoing off marble and stone. The military police surrounded Hale, their crisp uniforms and unflinching stares, reducing him to nothing more than a petulant figure trapped in his own arrogance. Their commanding officer stepped forward again, his tone flat, controlled. "Merciless, you disrespected the tomb, you disrespected the guard, you disrespected every soldier who ever wore this uniform. And now, everyone here will remember it." The officer didn't need to raise his voice. Authority dripped from every syllable. Hale tried to laugh, but it came out shaky, hollow. He pointed a trembling finger at Daniel Cross. "He's just a boy in costume. You're all fools for worshipping him." Daniel didn't move, didn't blink. His face remained carved from stone, rifle steady, gaze forward. The contrast was devastating. One man unraveling in chaos, another man anchored. In silence, the crowd erupted again, louder, angrier. "Show some respect. Hero. Hero." The words struck like hammers, the chant swelling until it was no longer a plea but a declaration. Phones streamed live. Reporters narrated in hushed, reverent tones. Around the world, millions would soon see it. This image, a politician crumbling, a soldier unbreakable. The commanding officer gestured, and 2 MPs stepped forward. They flanked Hale, their presence like iron bars of a cage. One of them spoke softly, but firmly. "Councilman, you're leaving." Hale recoiled. "No, don't touch me. I'll sue every one of you." But the MPs didn't need force. The crowd itself was pressure enough. Every jeer, every camera, every furious stare was a chain around Hale's body. His power was gone. His arrogance was exposed. One veteran stepped out from the crowd, voice cracking with emotion. "You don't belong here. Not in front of them." He pointed to the tomb. His hand shook, not with weakness, but with decades of grief and pride. "Get out." The words hit harder than any order. Hale's face flushed red. His mouth opened, but no defense came. He turned, stumbling toward the edge of the plaza, tripping over the chain he had so casually leaned against minutes earlier. Boos followed him. Cameras tracked him. His retreat was eternal, replayed in every angle, captured in every heart. And in the center of it all, Daniel Cross stood motionless. He hadn't smiled. He hadn't gloated. He hadn't broken posture even as the crowd roared and the politician crumbled. He had simply returned to his exact mark, his rifle balanced. His eyes locked forward as if the interruption had never happened. The applause erupted again. This time not for Hale's humiliation, but for the guard's discipline. Veterans saluted. Parents lifted their children onto shoulders. People pressed their hands over their hearts. Phones lowered, not because the moment was over, but because many realized some memories were too sacred to capture. The commanding officer turned back to Daniel, offering a crisp salute. Daniel did not return it, not here, not in the middle of his sacred watch. But the respect was clear, silent, undeniable, and then, silence returned. Not the tense, suffocating silence of moments before. This was different. It was reverent, healing. The tomb stood untouched. The guard stood eternal. The moment was over, and yet, for everyone there, it would never truly end. The world had seen arrogance collapse before honor, and Daniel Cross had not moved. Asterisk. The crowd didn't disperse quickly. For a long time they stood in silence, many still clutching their phones, others frozen in a kind of reverence they hadn't expected to feel that day. Tourists had arrived anticipating a performance, a simple changing of the guard. They were leaving with something much greater, a lesson in honor, discipline, and sacrifice. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking questions in voices too innocent to carry the weight of what had just happened. Veterans exchanged long looks, some with eyes glistening. Even the teenagers who had initially giggled were now somber, their arms folded across their chests as if ashamed of their earlier immaturity. And through it all, Daniel Cross remained immovable. His posture hadn't faltered, his rifle hadn't lowered. To the untrained eye, he was simply standing still, but to those who had witnessed everything, his silence had become the loudest sound on earth. The commanding officer who had confronted Hale lingered near the edge of the plaza. Speak to the crowd. He didn't order dispersal. Instead, he simply turned to face Daniel. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand in a salute. The gesture cut through the air like a blade. It wasn't part of protocol. It wasn't required. It was personal. A salute not just to a soldier on duty, but to what Daniel had stood for in the face of arrogance. The crowd stirred, realizing the weight of what they were witnessing. Veterans raised their trembling hands, some struggling with stiff shoulders and old injuries, but forcing their palms to their brows nonetheless. Parents guided their children's tiny hands to mimic the gesture. A wave of salutes rippled across the plaza, imperfect yet unified. Daniel did not respond. His duty bound him to stillness. But in that moment, he became something larger than himself. Near the front of the crowd, a little boy, no more than 6, tugged at his mother's sleeve. His wide eyes locked on Daniel. He leaned close and whispered, just loud enough for her to hear, "Mum, he's a hero." The mother's throat tightened. She squeezed her son's hand and whispered back, "Yes, sweetheart, he is." The words drifted, carried by the hush. Others heard them. Some repeated them under their breath. Soon, the word spread softly, reverently. Hero. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It was simply acknowledged, absorbed, lived for. Daniel. The moment passed like any other watch. His breathing remained steady, his muscles locked, his eyes fixed forward. But inside, beneath the armor of discipline, something stirred. He remembered the desert sun in Kandahar, the choking dust, the last smile of his friend Miller before the blast tore their unit apart. He remembered the weight of the flag folded into his hands. The sound of Miller's mother's sobs at the funeral. It was Miller who had first told him about the tomb of the unknown soldier. One day, Miller had said, "You'll stand there, and when you do, you won't just be guarding stone, you'll be guarding all of us, the ones who never made it home." Daniel hadn't answered then, but now, standing here, he finally understood when his shift ended. As the relief guard approached and the solemn ritual of the changing began, Daniel executed his movements flawlessly. Rifle click, heel pivot, step measured. To the crowd, it was the same precision as always. But to Daniel, every motion felt heavier, charged with the memory of what had just occurred. The relief guard took his position. Daniel marched away, posture rigid until he was out of the plaza's view. Only then, behind the marble colonnade, did he allow his shoulders to drop. His breathing deepened, and the faintest tremor ran through his hands. In the quiet corridor, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn dog tag. The edges were bent, the letters faded from years of rubbing between his fingers. Miller's name. Daniel closed his eyes. He pressed the tag into his palm until it bit into his skin. For a brief moment, he let himself whisper, barely audible, "We did it, brother. We held the line." A colonel waited in the shadows of the corridor, his presence respectful, patient. He stepped forward only when Daniel had steadied himself. "You did well, soldier," the colonel said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "I only stood still, sir." The colonel's eyes softened. "Exactly, and sometimes, that's harder than..." Moving, he reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew a small, folded note, creased and yellowed with time. He pressed it into Daniel's hand. "Your friend wrote this, Miller, before Kandahar. It was found among his things." Daniel froze, the paper fragile in his trembling grip. He carefully unfolded it. Inside, scrawled in messy handwriting, were just a few lines. "If I don't make it back, tell Daniel to take my place at the tomb. He'll understand why. He's the strongest man I know, not because he fights, but because he never breaks." Daniel's throat closed, his vision blurred. He folded the note back and pressed it against his chest, over his beating heart. The colonel didn't say another word. He simply offered a crisp salute, then walked away, leaving Daniel alone with his grief and his pride. Later that night, long after the plaza had emptied and the world had replayed the day's footage a million times, Daniel sat in his barracks, the dog tag and note laid gently beside his folded uniform. He didn't scroll through the news. He didn't watch the viral clips. He didn't need to. He knew what the world had seen: arrogance collapsing before honor, chaos silenced by stillness. He touched the dog tag once more, then placed it carefully in the box where he kept his medals. Not because it was an award, but because it was the truest symbol of his service. For Daniel Cross, the day hadn't been about humiliation or viral fame. It had been about one thing, and one thing only: keeping the promise. The promise to never move. The promise to never break. The promise to guard not just the tomb, but the very idea of sacrifice. And as sleep finally claimed him, a faint smile touched his lips. Miller had been right all along. There are moments in history that don't need a speech, or a ceremony, or even a headline. They speak for themselves. On that day, in front of the tomb of the unknown soldier, the world saw one of those moments. A politician tried to test the boundaries of tradition. He thought arrogance could bend respect. He thought noise could shatter silence. But what happened instead became proof of something timeless: that honor doesn't shout. It doesn't shove. It doesn't boast. Honor simply stands. And sometimes standing still is the loudest act of courage there is. Think of what the guard faced: insults, mockery, even physical contact. Every instinct in a normal person would scream, to react, to push back, to argue, to break composure. But Daniel Cross didn't move. He didn't break. He let his discipline do the speaking. In a world obsessed with going viral, chasing attention, and forcing reactions, here was a man who proved that silence can be stronger than 1,000 words. His refusal to bow to disrespect became a roar across the globe. That's why millions watched. That's why the footage spread to every corner of the internet. It wasn't just about a confrontation, it was about what it revealed: that traditions matter, that respect matters, that the sacrifices of those who never came home will never be forgotten, not as long as even one guard still takes that solemn post. The moral is clear. Strength doesn't always look like aggression. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones who refuse to move, no matter what storm rages in front of them. That is why the tomb guard remains one of the most sacred symbols of duty, because it's not just about guarding marble and stone, it's about guarding memory, guarding legacy, guarding the very idea that sacrifice should never be mocked. And for one little boy in the crowd that day who whispered the word hero to his mother, the lesson will last a lifetime. So, what do we take from this story? That true discipline is unshakable. That respect is non-negotiable. That honor, real honor, never moves. Tradition is not weakness. Stillness is strength.